All right, good morning. If you would turn to John chapter 11. We have been in a study for some time, looking just kind of slowly making our way through the gospel accounts. We're on the back end of this now, looking at questions Jesus asked. Just going through these accounts and looking at various questions, trying my best to get every single one. Sometimes I've come across where I missed one. Of course, as I've said before, we don't, if a question, same context, same question as in a previous gospel account, we're not repeating those since we've already covered them. But I'm doing my best to try to catch every single one of these questions. And if you see one that I miss, let me know, because I have a couple of times I had to go back where I found one that I'd missed. We were talking last week about the questions. There's a few of them in John chapter 11 in the context of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Of course, he delays going when he hears Lazarus is sick. He's talking to his disciples. Lazarus is sleeping, and of course their response is, well, if he's sleeping, that's a good thing. If you're sick, you need rest. And he finally comes out very plainly, Jesus does, and says, Lazarus is dead. And of course, Jesus knows exactly what he's going to do. So then he goes, and we pointed out last week, they say to him, you're going back to Judea when the Jews were seeking to kill you? We might paraphrase that. They're sort of saying to him, is that really the best idea? And so Jesus goes, and Thomas, who sometimes gets is more commonly known as Doubting Thomas, but here's Thomas. He's not very doubting here. In chapter 11, he says, let's go with him, that we may die also. Well, he's going to go there, and they're going to kill him. Well, let's go, we'll be with him. Now, of course, when it comes down to it, we know all the disciples forsook him and fled, but I don't know. The more I study it, the more I think Thomas has kind of gotten a bad rap, because even when you get to chapter 20, when Jesus is resurrected and Thomas is asking for evidence, that's not a bad thing. He wants the same evidence that they had. He wasn't with them when Jesus appeared to the group of disciples, or the group of the apostles, that first time. And they got to see the nail prints in his hand. They got to see his side that had been pierced. He wants the same evidence they had. And, it's kind of ironic. I don't know if ironic is the right word. Interesting. Because, again, Thomas sometimes gets a bad rap. I've heard of sermons, and maybe I'm trying to think, I might have even preached that sermon in years gone by. I would modify it now if I preached it. But I've heard of sermons, what we miss when we miss. And the content of the sermon, the point of the sermon is spot on. We can, when we're not at the assembly of the saints, we're missing out. And it's, even in this modern day, modern technology of having a live stream, it's not the same. In fact, it was John McGiffin. I was listening to a lesson by him recently, who'll be, God willing, with us tonight. But he made the statement that online services are a lot like those little, I don't know what you call it, like a fire thing you can get on your TV or on your computer screen, Sometimes people have that, especially like at Christmas time. They'll have that just on their big screen TV, and it's a picture of a fire, and it's just, kind of on a loop, and it's nice ambiance and all of that, but you're not getting any warmth from it, right? It's not accomplishing the same purpose as a real fire. And so there are benefits, yes, but it's not the same. But anyway, the sermon talks about, old Thomas, he missed out on some things. well, yeah, he missed out on some things, but sometimes I've just heard that sermon started with the premise that Thomas just kind of decided not to be there when there was a church meeting going on or something. And of course, church hadn't been established at that point. But even if we were talking in the Jewish context, you know, their synagogue service, this wasn't some kind of scheduled service of God's people that he just decided to miss. We don't know why he wasn't there. He may have had a very legitimate, perfectly good reason not to be there. But he did miss out. And there's always something that is missed. And that's why faithful Christians always, even when they can't be there, they say, oh, I wish I could be there. And of course, you know, I've talked to so many Christians. Most of us have been there at some point where we wish we could be there. But for whatever reason, it could be work, it could be sickness, it could be whatever, we can't be. But, Thomas, you know, bless him, he sometimes I think he just kind of gets picked on. But anyway, Thomas says, let's go with him that we may die also. And so they head back, and Martha comes out, meets Jesus when he's not quite there to Bethany. She says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now I know whatever you ask. What is that, verse 22? Whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. And so Jesus says to her, thy brother shall rise again. And we really finished the question 26, the question in verse 26 last week. But I just got back to my office last Sunday afternoon and was looking at my notes, and I thought, boy, I just kind of skipped over some things that I wanted to mention. So I just want to go back and mention a couple of things on that before I move on to our next question. Notice in verse 23, Jesus says to her, thy brother shall rise again. And what is Martha's response? The first two words are, I know. Sometimes somebody will tell you something and you say, well, I know that. I'm aware. And not being a smart aleck, but she's just saying, yes, I do know that. I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Of course, Jesus says one who believes in him, one who lives in him and believes in him shall never die. And I can't remember if we pointed it out last week or not, but I'll go back and grab this verse from chapter 8, verse 51. Verily, verily, I say unto you, if a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. He's not talking about physical death. It's important that a man wants to die. After this, the judgment, Hebrews 9:27. But he's talking about that second death, the lake of fire. It's talked about in Revelation. But I just mainly wanted to go back and look at this and just point out that sometimes I hear people talk about, in the Old Testament, they had no concept of a resurrection. I've even heard this. In fact, I don't know if I took issue with it. I questioned one day when I was down at the Biblical History Center in LaGrange, and they were talking about this, and they were talking about I've shown. You may not remember. It's been a long time since we studied that, but I did a class some time ago where we looked at a lot of pictures from the Biblical History Center, and we talked about some of those things and how interesting those things are and how they tie in. But one of the things that they have there is this mock-up of a tomb, a burial site that was discovered at Ketef Hinnom. It's not too terribly far from Jerusalem. It was discovered quite by accident. A young boy was kind of tinkering with a hammer, and he hit a rock just right. It split, and underneath was just this mother lode of treasure, jewelry, trinkets, and things like that had been buried with these people. And what had happened, they as they began to investigate, they realized that this tomb's ceiling had just collapsed, and that was significant because otherwise, like just about every other tomb around there, it would have been looted, robbed. People come and they'd find a tomb like that, and they know a lot of times people would bury a loved one with their favorite piece of jewelry. We do that sometimes to this day, right? But that ceiling had collapsed, and so I guess somebody coming by just saw big slab of rock, and it had collapsed just right so that it just covered everything and nobody saw it. And so they discover all this. I mean, it was just an amazing find, and they found a little tiny silver scroll and labored over that and finally figured out it was the priestly blessing. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee. The Lord bless thee with peace, from Numbers 6, I believe it is. And it may, to this day, I know at the time it was the oldest inscription, the oldest piece of scripture that had ever been found at that point. It may still be. But it's somewhere in, I don't remember who was the tour guide that day, but I was with a group, and they were talking about this phrase that you see sometimes in the Old Testament, gathered to their fathers. Somebody died, he was gathered to his fathers. God even says that to David, 2 Samuel 7. David wants to build a house for the Lord. Prophet Nathan originally tells him, sure, go. God says to Nathan, no, he's not going to, David's not going to build my house and this temple to represent God's presence among his people. He said his son will. And so he sends a message to David. God sends a message to David through the prophet, and he says, you aren't going to build this house, but your son is. But oh, by the way, God says, I'm going to build you a house, David. And he's not talking about a physical house. He's talking about a dynasty. David's descendants, even after the kingdom split, every single king of Judah was a direct descendant of David. You see that lineage, and that's some of the importance of the genealogies that we see in Scripture, such as Matthew 1, Luke 3. But he says to David, when you sleep with your fathers, when you are old and you have gone to rest with your fathers, then I'm going to establish your son, his kingdom. He'll build me a house. But that phrase is something similar, resting with your fathers, gathered to your fathers, gathered to your ancestors, is used sometimes. And you see that in the tomb at Ketef Hinnom, because there was this upper section, and there's like these carved out spots in the rock, and you could even see it if any of you were in that class and you recall those pictures, where like the body lays and then there's kind of a cutout inset for even the head. And when you look at that, I think there were 3 or might have been 6 different spots there carved out in that upper like flat piece. And you know, sometimes the question comes up, well, what do you do when the 7th person dies? And the answer is, once the bodies have decomposed and they call it disarticulation of the bones, the tendons and all that have broken down, and the skeleton will collapse, they will gather the bones, and there were these little compartments underneath. And they would put those bones in there, and now you have spots open for the next family member. And sometimes generations of families would be buried in one spot. And so it seems to me from my research that when they would gather those disarticulated bones and put them down underneath, that's kind of the idea, and just in general burying in that tomb, because so many times, again, it might be multiple generations, so the idea of being gathered to your fathers, you're joining them in that sense, in that physical sense, in that grave, understanding that the soul lives on. But it was stated by somebody that day that, well, see, they didn't have an understanding about the afterlife and the resurrection particularly. And so they would use this expression, gather to your fathers. You know, you're just gathered to your fathers, and kind of that's it. And bless their hearts, they just didn't understand. And all that's just to say, when you get here to John chapter 11, the statement Martha makes, I think it's very clear they did have an understanding. They don't have as full of understanding as we have today, because Jesus came and he more fully revealed the Father and the Father's will and the truth of God. But did they not understand or not know anything about the resurrection? I just don't think that's true at all. And Job comes to mind as well. Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he'll stand at the last day upon the earth, and I will see him. And so there's no way to interpret that statement of Job without some kind of a reference to a resurrection and even a judgment, standing before God to give an account. Tim, you were going to say something.
2 Samuel 12:23 is an interesting twist. Instead of gathered to our fathers, it is David, when his younger son died, said that he would be gathered to his son instead of his fathers. And definitely, the afterlife, he was fully aware of.
Yeah, he was.
That makes no sense whatsoever.
Because his servants are just puzzled. I mean, David, the child is sick. David is fasting. He won't eat. He won't get up. And he kind of sees them whispering. And he just point blank asks some of his servants, is the child dead? And they realize they can't lie to the king. And so they say, well, yeah, he's dead. David gets up. He washes his face, cleans up, and says, I'm hungry. Let's eat. And his servants are kind of, what are you doing? I mean, you just found out your child is dead and you want to get up and have a meal. And he says, hey, look, while the child was sick, I prayed, I fasted. Who knows whether God will be gracious and the child would recover. But he's died. He's dead now. I can't bring him back. But he says, as Tim points out there in verse 23, I can go to him. So, yeah, he understood. And it's kind of an interesting, as you pointed out, kind of an interesting paradox there, because a lot of times you read that gathered to their fathers or whatever. David says, one day I want to be gathered to him and have that reunion in heaven. So I wanted to mention that because sometimes you'll hear people just sort of, it's almost just in passing. I see this, and I've seen it a lot in the last few years in some of my reading of different, whether it be a commentary or sermon book, whatever. People saying, folks in the Old Testament just didn't really have this knowledge of the afterlife or the resurrection. I think it's pretty clear because Martha says, I know he'll rise again at the last day. Now, she doesn't understand he's about to rise here. And I think she's sort of hinting, not terribly subtly, to Jesus that she wants him to do that. She fully believes he's capable if he chooses to do so. And that's in his plan and the Father's plan. But she understood there was going to be a resurrection. Scott, go ahead. Right.
From the prophet, Isaiah prophesied the resurrection. Eternal resurrection has always been right along with it.
Yeah, and I don't get it. I don't understand why people come up with this like, oh, they didn't have any knowledge of that. Because, yeah, there are other references in the Old Testament. Yet they're not nearly as numerous as in the New Testament because, again, grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And John tells us that right here in John's gospel account. Not to say that there was no grace, no truth before, but they came in their fullest sense. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot more revealed about it through Jesus and his teaching. But, yeah, they had an idea. And that, as you pointed out, that was the main point of contention between the Pharisees and Sadducees. And it's kind of interesting because Paul, when he's before them, some of the Jews, what eventually leads to his going to Rome, he realizes that some of them are Sadducees, some of them are Pharisees, and so he says, oh, well, I'm called into question this day pertaining to the resurrection of the dead, and that gets them kind of yaying back and forth with each other.
Because he knows the council is filled with both.
Right, yeah, he knows that's...
And it makes them start fighting each other.
Right, yeah, they kind of turned attention away from him for a little bit to argue with each other. But yeah, people had a knowledge of that, and so... Again, I just want to mention that because sometimes you see that, and I didn't want somebody to, it's not a huge deal either way, whether they did or didn't, but I just think that's kind of an unfair assumption that, and maybe even accusation that people make against those from the Old Testament era. But even back as far as Job, which if Job was, and I think the evidence is there, if Job was written just not terribly long after the flood, then it would be the oldest book of Scripture if it was written just after the flood by Job. And again, I think the evidence is there. So you've got all the way back to Job. You've got with David, Sadducees and the Pharisees, even, arising in that intertestamental period. There's just so much evidence there that these people, they had an understanding, a knowledge at least, that there's going to be a resurrection at the last day. So Jesus, of course, tells her, I am the resurrection and the life, verse 25. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And then he asks her that question, believest thou this? And so, if we follow Jesus, he's pointed out before, whoever drinks of living water will never thirst. He's pointed out, that was chapter 4, chapter 6. You eat my flesh, drink my blood. And of course, that's, people get kind of wild with that sometimes, but it's not a reference even to the Lord's Supper. It's just talking about imbibing his teaching as a package deal, not kind of trying to pick and choose. But he says, if you do that, you'll never hunger. He's going to say later on, I'm the bread of life. You eat the bread of life. You take that, imbibe his teachings, put it into practice in your life, live faithfully to it. You'll never hunger. So never thirst, never hunger. Now he says, I'm the resurrection and life. He that lives and believes in me, though we're dead, he shall live. You'll never die. So, kind of becomes an obvious question. It's almost a rhetorical question. Who wouldn't want to follow Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God? And so when he says, believest thou this, she says, yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. We talked about that last week. One of these confessions that we read about from time to time in the gospel accounts where people confess Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. When she had so said, she calls Mary and says, the master is come and calleth for thee. And so Mary goes quickly, comes to them, and the Jews think that Mary is going out to the grave to weep there. They don't realize, of course, Martha has called her privately, secretly. And Mary, she comes where Jesus was. She says the exact same thing to Jesus that Martha said, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. We talked about that word, groaned in the spirit, last week, and a very interesting word study there. I won't rehash all that. But then Jesus asked the question, and this is where we left off last week. We kind of covered it quickly. Where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. So he spoke this to Lazarus' sister. Mary is there at that point as well, and probably some others also. But Jesus has a plan. He knows exactly what he's going to do. That's why he waited 2 days before he came. He's got a plan. He knows exactly what he's going to do. And where we left off last week was just pointing out that his question here puts the attention on the grave, the body, and of course the impending miracle, the impending resurrection of Lazarus. Where have you laid him? Take us to the grave. So all the attention is going to be in exactly where Jesus wants it to be. Now, the next question, the last question in chapter 11, is from verse 40. So Jesus says, where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. John 11:35, there's your easiest to memorize verse perhaps in all of Scripture. Jesus wept. Right up there with 1 Thessalonians 5:17, right? Pray without ceasing. Then said the Jews, behold how he loved him. We've talked before in other lessons. I know I did a sermon one time on the emotions of Jesus, and you see Jesus weeping here. You see him weeping in the garden. You actually don't have that recorded in the gospel accounts. It's actually recorded for us in Hebrews chapter 5 with strong crying and tears. But you have Jesus weeping there in the garden. You have him weeping here. There are occasions when Jesus, you see his humanity, his emotions. Here, Jesus wept. I think it's, and there have been entire sermons preached just on that short little phrase, Jesus wept. Well, why did he weep? Well, he loved Lazarus, Martha, Mary, no doubt because of seeing the results of the consequences of sin. Humans die because of sin. Death entered this world because of sin. So no doubt there has to be a connection with that. Perhaps Jesus is thinking about his own impending death as an atoning sacrifice for sin. but it was not something that he looked forward to by any stretch, right? A lot of different reasons we could give why he wept, but the Jews, they said, yes, sir.
You know, if you ask 10 different people, you get 13 different answers.
Yeah.
So I know y'all wonder what I think about it. Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Where was he? Where had he been? In paradise. He was weeping because he knew he was going to bring him back to earth.
And I think that's a good point, too. Perhaps Jesus is weeping just knowing that, because Lazarus, when he hears Lazarus come forth, yes, this is King of Kings, Lord of Lords. It's not like you can say, oh, Lord, I'm here in paradise. No thanks. So he's going to come forth. But he's leaving paradise. He's coming back to a world of suffering and pain and sickness. And guess what's going to happen to Lazarus again? He's going to die. And so, I think you could make a strong case that there's some weeping going on because Jesus knows that, and I don't think there's any question, Lazarus, it's not that he would say, oh, no, I don't want to do this, Lord. Because every indication is he would do whatever the Lord asked of him. But he's going to be an object lesson, and that's, but the difficulty for him is, he's got to leave paradise to come back to this earth.
Do you think Lazarus may have told people what it was like?
I don't know.
Or would he have had a memory of it?
You almost think he would have to. I mean, because you don't lose consciousness in death, and coming back you wouldn't lose consciousness. I know, like in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul's going to say, he heard things that were unlawful for man to utter. So he doesn't elaborate on that. And so it may be that was the case with Lazarus as well. Sometimes people ask him, and maybe he just says, hey, it's not something that I'm to talk about. You need to, there are things that are revealed and there are things that are not. And but that is an interesting thought, because I don't know how he wouldn't remember. And putting that with 2 Corinthians 12, I don't know. It seems maybe it wouldn't have been something he would describe. Maybe just to say, hey, everything that Jesus has been telling us, it's so true. All I can tell you is this: everything God has said about it, everything Jesus has revealed is true, and then some. But I don't know. I would lean towards saying probably not in detail, but again, I don't know. The Bible just doesn't say 100% for sure, but that's an interesting question. So the Jews say, behold how he loved him. Some of them said, now, again, he's turned their attention to the grave, the body. Some of them said, you could just see some of them standing off to the side. They see Jesus weeping. They see him there with Mary and Martha. And they're kind of like, well, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Maybe they're kind of some back and forth. Like, I don't understand. I mean, if he could open the eyes of the one that was born blind, you would think he could have kept Lazarus from dying. I don't know. Jesus said, take ye away the stone. Oh, sorry, I skipped verse 38. Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself. That's that same word from verse 33. Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Talked about this before. Again, there's a kind of a replica of that style of grave. It seems this would be very similar, if not the same, as the type of grave Jesus was laid in. They would have carved out in a cave, carved out of a stone, and very expensive to do because you don't have the modern equipment we have when it comes to carving out a cave into a solid rock. Sometimes there's a cave already there, and they just, they may carve out specific spots for different members of the family, and then they just cover the opening, but sometimes they would actually carve it into solid rock. These were very, very expensive and time-consuming to make, these graves. But then you would have a stone, and usually it will be like a disc, is how we would describe it. Maybe, a foot or more thick, but it's flat. and it would just, you could roll it in front of the opening, and that keeps out, the idea there is to keep out, or at least to deter robbers. But as much as anything, it was, not all robbers are humans. And it was as much as anything to deter animals getting in there and desecrating the body of your loved ones. And so not only would you have that disc stone in front of the door, it would often be placed on an incline. So its natural position is closed. And if you want to open it, you kind of have to go up a little bit of an incline. So it's not just a simple matter of, well, it's a stone, it's going to roll. You got to actually roll it up. And so it was not an easy thing to do. And so you have the women coming to Jesus' tomb after his death on that third day, on that Sunday, very early in the morning. And part of their conversation on the way there is what? Who's going to roll the stone away? There were a few different women there, but they understood this is not going to be something we can accomplish. Who's going to do this for us? Because that thing's going to be heavy and it's not going to be easy to move. And of course, it was something they didn't have to worry about. They didn't know that until they got there, but Jesus says, take you away the stone. Now Martha's response, the sister of him that was dead, verse 39, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. You want us to take away the stone? They don't have embalming. It's not that there was no type of embalming at that time, because there was. How do we know that, by the way? The Egyptians. And we know that from history, but we also know that from Joseph. But the Jews didn't do that. That was not the common practice. So somebody dies, they're buried same day. And so by 4 days, yeah. And of course, that's why you have the women coming to the tomb of Jesus. Part of the reason they're coming is they're bringing all these spices and things to anoint the body of Jesus. And that helps to mask some of the strong smell of decomposition of the body. But so she says to Jesus, are you sure? It's been 4 days. This is going to be quite pungent. Jesus saith unto her, verse 40, said I not unto thee, this is our question, that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God? Did I not tell you, if you believe, you'll see the glory of God? Now she's kind of hesitating here. Not that she's unbelieving, and I think probably most of us would have been the same way. Probably would have had the same question. Are you sure about that? It's going to smell pretty bad. He says, didn't I say? If you believe, you see the glory of God. Well, verse 41 says, then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice. And man, can't you just imagine? He cried with a loud voice. This indicates he didn't just say, Lazarus, come on out. He says, Lazarus, come forth. Man, that's kind of on my bucket list. One day when I get to heaven, I want to see that scene played out. He that was dead came forth bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto them, loose him and let him go. Can you just imagine this scene? First of all, as Jesus cries in that loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. I've mentioned it several times. Y'all are probably familiar with it as well. Brother Marshall Keeble used to say, it's a good thing he said Lazarus, because if he hadn't specified Lazarus, all the graves would have emptied. And one day, he's not going to specify the name. It's just going to be a cry of, come forth. Yes, sir.
Could you imagine being there and hearing that? I bet you could have heard a pin drop. The quietness that would have existed from the people, especially Mary and Martha. They're desiring to see their brother again. They knew Jesus had the power. There was Jews there. There was men that pushed the stone away. And then Jesus proclaims this, Lazarus, come forth. And everybody's just
And I mean, I just, I don't know. I'm like you, Robert. I just sort of picture this, and it's, that's why I say it's one of those on my bucket list. I don't even know if we'll have that in heaven, but if we do, I want to be in line, first in line to see. I sort of picture maybe in heaven one day God will allow us to see as if we're like at an IMAX, or maybe even better than that, like you're there, and you can see what these Bible scenes were like, David fighting Goliath and some of these things. But, like you said, there's so many different people there. You got Mary and Martha, and can you imagine them just with bated breath as Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth, and just kind of waiting. You got the men who roll away the stone. They're probably sitting there, and they're like, whoa, and they're kind of reeling perhaps from the stench of decomposing flesh. You got some of the Jews there that are not believers, and maybe they're like, what is he doing? And so perhaps with all that going on, maybe that's why he cries out with this loud voice. And there had to be, it might have just been a brief moment, but a moment between Lazarus come forth and he comes walking out of the grave. Maybe some of the unbelievers are going, what does he think he's doing? Maybe some of the others are just kind of sitting there like, whoa, that's a bold thing to say. Maybe Mary and Martha are sitting there and they're like, they're fully anticipating he's going to come out. And then out he walks. And he's bound in these grave clothes. They would take sometimes even just the clothes you died in if you were poor. Just having this grave, it doesn't seem that this was a poor family, but if you had more means, financial means, but they would take these strips of cloth, wind it, and when you ran out, you'd tie it off and tie it to another and wind. So it might not look exactly like we picture a mummy looking today, but something similar at least. And even his face is bound with a grave cloth. And so you can almost picture like, probably would be some kind of a stilted type walking, as he's trying to, and sort of having to, not really knowing exactly where he's going because he can't see very well. And it says Jesus then, for that reason, if nothing else, says loose him and let him go. Man, it just has to be, just you can only imagine, like I said, I just want to see that one day.
Don't you think to a certain extent they were fearful when they saw him come out?
Oh, I'm sure some were terrified. And maybe even with Mary and Martha, a sense of trepidation coupled with just ecstatic joy. Is it real? Is this real? Did he just make the body? There was a time when, I think it was during Josiah, his reign, they cast a dead body into a pit, and it came in contact with the bones of Elijah or Elisha. I sometimes mix those up so bad. I want to say Elijah, but it might have been Elisha. But it came into contact with one of those prophets, and when it did, the body just stood up. Well, it didn't come back to life. It just, something to, it seems that God's purpose there was just emphasizing this holy man of God. But maybe they wondered, is he just making the body walk? Is he really is it him? And of course, they find out later it was. And we learn from the rest of the chapter, many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him, but some of them went their way to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Some of them went and tattled. Said, oh, you listen to what he's done now, which is just never ceases to amaze me. Yes, sir, Tim?
Fascinating, if you're not careful, you lose the purpose in this. We learn the purpose of all this in Mark 16:20. They went forth everywhere, working miracles with signs following to confirm the word. So Jesus is confirming, he's using this occasion something else, I think a life lesson that we can all learn from this story. Would you say that Jesus, since he had the ability to bring forth the dead, could have also had the ability to have simply told the stone to move to the left or to the right? I've often heard that this story shows us that the things in life that we are capable of doing ourselves, God expects us to do. And the things that we're unable to do, that's where we lean on him. And this story bears out. He told them to move the stone. I'm firmly convinced he could, a man that can walk on the water, a man that can raise the dead, could have simply moved the stone with his thoughts. But he didn't do that, even though they were in grief.
That is an excellent point because, yeah, I mean, the man that can say, Lazarus come forth, and he comes back from the Hadean realm and is alive, yeah, he could have just said, oh, hey, I see the stone is there, just, and it's gone. But he didn't. Because, yeah, there are things that we can do. There are things we can't. There are things we can. And that is an excellent observation and lesson from this. And so, yes, Jesus is confirming once again, he is God. And even with this, raising someone from the dead, some folks are going to say, right there at the end of the chapter, we know he's done a notable miracle. What are we going to do? Of course, the obvious answer is just, how about believing? How about becoming his disciple, following him for life? Some of them will, but many will not. All right, we'll stop there. We got our next question is in chapter 12, a very, very interesting context as Jesus is here at that feast. We'll look at that, God willing, next week. Thank y'all so much. Really appreciate excellent thoughts and comments and observations. We'll have a short break before worship.